On a bustling downtown street, two cops, Officer Miller and Officer Davis, walked side by side, scanning the crowd with hawk-like precision, their eyes flicking over everyone and everything they passed. The city was busy as usual, with people hurrying along the sidewalk, oblivious to the constant surveillance happening above them. The sun beat down hard, and the air was thick with heat as a young black boy walked casually down the street, his hands tucked into his hoodie pockets, his head down slightly as he listened to music on his earbuds. The boy looked no older than 16, his face youthful and full of promise, yet in the eyes of the two officers he was nothing more than a potential threat. Officer Miller, a tall man in his early 40s, was the first to notice him. He nudged Officer Davis, who was a few steps behind them, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. It was an instinctive motion, one that came from years of being on the force. Davis glanced up, catching the direction of Miller's gaze, and followed his line of sight straight to the boy walking alone down the sidewalk. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. The boy didn't seem to fit the usual profile of someone they would stop, but something about him triggered a sense of unease in Miller's gut. The boy didn't look like he belonged on the street. This was a neighborhood known for its high crime rate, and people like him didn't usually stroll here without cause. As the boy passed by a convenience store, Miller tilted his head towards Davis and muttered under his breath, "Something's off about him." Davis didn't reply immediately. He just continued watching the boy with a quiet intensity. The boy hadn't noticed the two officers trailing behind him. His steps were slow but purposeful, and he seemed completely absorbed in the music blaring into his ears. After a few moments of silent observation, Davis finally spoke, his voice low and firm. "You think he's up to something?" Miller paused for a moment, then nodded ever so slightly. "Could be," he said. "He doesn't belong here." Davis considered this and then made his decision. "We should check him out." Miller's eyes flicked towards Davis's face and back to the boy, who was now a few paces ahead. They had the advantage. The boy was alone, no witnesses nearby, and the officers were well within their rights to approach him if they suspected any wrongdoing. Without hesitation, Miller signaled to Davis, who nodded in agreement. They quickened their pace, closing the distance between them and the boy without making a sound. As they got closer, Miller's hand moved to his radio as he called out to Davis, "Let's see what he's carrying." They were getting close now, only a few feet away, when Miller's voice broke through the boy's music. "Hey kid, stop." The boy, startled but didn't flinch immediately. He pulled his earbuds from his ears and turned around, slowly looking out at the officers as they stood in front of him, blocking his path. His expression was blank, a little confused, but not immediately frightened. The boy stood still, trying to gauge the situation, and with a calm voice he asked, "What's going on, officers?" His question was met with a sharp command from Davis, "Empty your pockets." The boy's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't speak. Instead, he lifted one hand from his pocket and began to pull out his phone slowly but cautiously. The boy's fingers trembled slightly as he pulled his phone from his pocket, his mind racing, but his face stayed calm. He wasn't sure what was going on or why these officers had approached him in the first place, but he could feel the tension rising in the air, as if the weight of their gaze was pressing against him. The phone was a simple device, no flashy features or expensive brand, just a plain model that seemed too ordinary to be worth any kind of interest. Yet, as he handed it over reluctantly, Davis grabbed it from his hand and quickly checked the screen. Miller stepped closer to the boy, his presence looming large as he stared down at him, his eyes cold and calculating. Davis handed the phone back with a look of suspicion, but made no comment. Instead, his attention shifted to the boy's other pocket. "Empty the rest of your pockets now," he demanded, his tone no longer polite but harsh, almost accusatory. The boy hesitated for a moment, then complied, sliding his other hand into his hoodie pocket and pulling out a small wallet. It was nothing special, a few crumpled bills and an old ID card, but Davis's eyes seemed to scrutinize every detail, as if searching for some hidden motive or sign of criminal activity. "What's this?" Davis asked, lifting the wallet in front of the boy's face. The boy could feel his heart beat faster, but he didn't show it. His expression remained neutral as he spoke. "It's my ID, my money. I don't know what you're looking for." But Davis ignored his words, shaking his head as if he didn't believe the boy. "What about the rest of it?" he muttered, the accusation lingering in his voice. Miller was still silent, his eyes scanning the boy's face for any sign of fear or deceit. But the boy didn't flinch, didn't tremble under their scrutiny. He wasn't acting like a typical suspect caught in the act of something illegal. He wasn't responding how they expected someone in his position to react, and that was making them uneasy. Miller exchanged a look with Davis, and then turned his attention back to the boy. "Where you headed?" he asked, his voice sharp as he stepped even closer, forcing the boy to look up at him. "Just home," the boy replied again, his voice steady now, but the edge of frustration creeping in. He wasn't sure how much longer he could stay calm under this pressure. They were treating him like a criminal, and he had done nothing wrong. Miller seemed unsatisfied with this answer, his eyes narrowing as he stepped back slightly. "A kid like you shouldn't be out here by yourself at this hour," Davis added, his tone dripping with disdain. "What's your deal? You got something to hide?" The boy felt the anger rising inside him, but he bit it back instead, choosing to stare the officers down silently. But his body tensed with every word. The longer they kept him here, the more he realized there was nothing he could say to convince them of his innocence. They had already made up their minds about him based solely on his appearance. It was obvious to him now that this wasn't about any specific suspicion. It was about the simple fact that he was black and walking down the wrong street at the wrong time in the wrong clothes with the wrong attitude. The boy's hands began to sweat as Miller and Davis closed in on him, their questions growing sharper and more invasive. The air between them was thick with tension. He felt cornered like an animal trapped in a cage, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of showing fear. He stood tall and straight, trying his best to hold his ground. "I already told you I'm just going home," he said, his voice a little firmer this time, but Miller wasn't buying it. His eyes flicked up and down the boy's body, as if searching for a lie hidden beneath his skin. "Don't get smart with us, kid," he snapped, his voice cold and commanding. "You don't belong here." Davis echoed the sentiment, stepping closer, his presence imposing. "You got anything on you we should know about?" The boy's heart raced, but he kept his breathing steady. He knew he had nothing to hide, but these officers seemed intent on making him guilty of something he didn't understand. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out of this situation, but nothing came to him. It felt like he was suffocating under their glare, their words hammering into him with no escape. "What's your name?" Miller asked suddenly, his voice low and controlled, but still laced with suspicion. The boy hesitated for just a moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to answer. "Jaden," he replied finally, his voice quiet but defiant. "Jaden what?" Miller pressed. Davis stepped forward again, a little too close now. The boy could smell the sweat on his skin, the sour scent of authority. "Just Jaden," the boy answered, his stomach turning with every word he spoke. He wanted to scream at them, to tell them they were wrong, but he knew it wouldn't make any difference. He wasn't sure how long they would keep him here, or what they would do next, but he wasn't about to let them break him under this pressure. Miller narrowed his eyes and took another step closer to Jaden, his voice turning into a growl. "This is your last chance, kid. What's really going on?" Jaden's mind was screaming at him to run, but his body remained frozen, his feet planted firmly on the ground. As he stared back into Miller's eyes, he knew there was no running from this, not without causing more trouble, not without giving them more of an excuse to drag him into something he didn't deserve. "I'm not hiding anything," Jaden said, his voice steady now, even though his chest felt tight from the weight of their accusations. Miller let out a frustrated sigh, clearly not satisfied with the boy's answer. But before he could speak again, a voice interrupted the tension, shattering the moment. "What's going on here?" The voice was deep and commanding, and as it rang out, Jaden's eyes darted toward the sound of it. The officers froze mid-step, their faces suddenly paling as they turned to face the newcomer standing a few feet away. An expensive black SUV had pulled up without warning, and a tall figure stepped out from it, his suit sharp and his demeanor calm. But the presence he exuded was unmistakable. Jaden's heart skipped a beat as he saw the man's face. The man was familiar, far too familiar, in fact, and the realization hit Jaden like a ton of bricks. The man who had just approached was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his posture confident and authoritative. Jaden's stomach dropped as he recognized the man standing before him. It was his father's boss, Chief Hall, the head of the entire police department. Jaden's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but the surprise and shock quickly turned into disbelief as he realized what had just happened. The two officers, Officer Miller and Officer Davis, who had been harassing him moments ago, now stood rigid and silent, their faces drained of color at the sight of their superior. Chief Hall's piercing gaze swept over them with a sharpness that immediately made the officers stand at attention. "What's going on here?" Chief Hall's voice was calm, but his words were laced with authority. It was clear he wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was demanding an explanation. Miller and Davis exchanged uneasy glances, neither one of them daring to speak. At first, the tension in the air was suffocating as the boy Jaden tried to process the situation in front of him. He had always known his father's position as the head of the police department, but he had never expected to be caught in a situation like this, especially not in front of his father's boss, and certainly not being harassed in public by officers who should have known better. Sir," Miller started, his voice faltering. "This kid was acting suspicious, so we stopped him for a routine check." We thought he might have been up to something." His words trailed off as Chief Hall's gaze fixed him with an icy stare. Hall said nothing, but his expression spoke volumes. It was clear he didn't believe a word of it. "Suspicious," Chief Hall repeated slowly, his eyes narrowing. "This boy." He turned to Jaden, now his gaze softer but still serious. "What were they doing to you?" Jaden stood there frozen, unable to fully process the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded, but the weight of Hall's question was enough to break him from his stupor. "They were just accusing me of something I didn't do," Jaden said, his voice trembling slightly, but he held his ground as he spoke. He was no longer the scared boy standing on the sidewalk being bullied by two officers. He was speaking to someone who might just have the power to end this madness once and for all. Chief Hall looked back at the two officers, his eyes hardening in an instant. "You thought this boy was suspicious. Why? Because he's walking down the street dressed like this?" He gestured to Jaden, who wore a simple hoodie and jeans. "You think because he's young and black, he's automatically a threat?" The words hit Miller and Davis like a slap in the face. They didn't know how to respond. Their mouths hung open in stunned silence as their superior continued to reprimand them for their actions. Chief Hall didn't raise his voice, but the intensity of his words was enough to send a chill down both officers' spines. Jaden watched as the officers shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny, his anger slowly subsiding as he realized what was happening before his eyes. They weren't going to get away with this. He wasn't going to let them. But just as the situation seemed to reach its peak, Chief Hall's eyes softened as he turned back to Jaden. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said, his tone now gentler. "I know you must be confused right now, but I want you to know this won't stand." The words barely registered in Jaden's mind as he processed them, but a small spark of hope began to grow inside him. Maybe things were about to change. Maybe the officers who had harassed him would finally face the consequences for their actions. Chief Hall turned to Officer Miller and Officer Davis, his eyes cold and unwavering. His gaze felt like a weight pressing down on them. Both. Davis shifted uncomfortably, his hands twitching as if he wanted to defend his actions but couldn't find the words. Miller was the first to speak, but his voice came out weak and unsure. "Sir, we were just doing our job," he said, his words almost pleading, as if hoping Hall would somehow justify their actions. But Chief Hall wasn't having it. "Doing your job?" Hall repeated slowly, his voice edged with disbelief. "You're telling me your job is to stop a young black boy walking down the street with no probable cause and harass him like he's some kind of criminal?" Hall's words were sharp and deliberate, each one a reminder of just how wrong the officers had been. The weight of the situation was sinking in for Miller and Davis, and it showed. Their faces grew paler with every passing second. They both stood silently now, not daring to meet Hall's eyes. Davis finally found his voice, though it was shaky and unsure. "We thought he was acting suspicious, sir," he muttered, but the excuse sounded hollow, and even to him it didn't hold water. "Suspicious how?" Hall asked, his voice low but intense, his eyes locked on Davis like a predator waiting to pounce. "What exactly about this boy made you think he was suspicious?" Davis couldn't answer the question because there was no legitimate reason. There was no rational explanation for their actions. They had singled Jaden out based solely on his appearance and their own bias, not on any actual evidence of wrongdoing. It was a moment of reckoning for both officers. They could feel the sting of their own guilt sinking in, but neither one of them could bring themselves to apologize, not yet anyway. They stood there like statues waiting for the inevitable fallout. Chief Hall's gaze softened, but only slightly as he turned his attention back to Jaden. "I'm sorry for what you've been put through," he said, his voice now more sympathetic. "This shouldn't have happened." Jaden nodded silently, but there was a coldness to his eyes that suggested he didn't fully believe the apology. He wasn't sure how much this apology would change, or if it would even matter in the long run. He had been humiliated in front of strangers, and wrongly accused by two officers who hadn't even bothered to treat him with basic respect. Hall gave the two officers one last look before he spoke again. "I'm going to make sure this is properly investigated," he said, his tone final. "And I expect both of you to write up a full report detailing your actions and why you thought it was necessary to stop this young man." The officers didn't argue. They simply nodded in defeat, feeling the weight of their mistake finally crushing them. Miller opened his mouth to speak again, but Hall raised a hand, silencing him. "Not another word." Hall commanded, his voice firm. "I've already heard enough from you." Davis and Miller exchanged a glance, both realizing the consequences of their actions were far greater than they had imagined. It wasn't just about a misplaced stop anymore. It was about the trust they had broken and the damage they had done to Jaden for nothing more than their own assumptions and prejudice. "Now," Hall said, turning back to Jaden, his tone softening once again, I'm going to make sure this never happens to you again. Jaden stood there trying to absorb everything that had just happened, but his mind kept racing. The words of Chief Hall echoed in his ears. But the weight of what the officers had done to him was still heavy on his shoulders. The apology seemed hollow after everything he had been through, the humiliation, the fear, the anger that had built up inside him. None of it was going to go away with a few words from someone who hadn't even been there when it happened. But he didn't say anything. He didn't know what to say. His thoughts were a blur, and his body still felt tense from the confrontation. The anger had subsided a little, but it hadn't disappeared. Chief Hall seemed to sense this as he looked at Jaden carefully, his eyes filled with a mix of understanding and regret. I know this must have been hard for you, Hall said, his voice sincere. But I want you to know I'll make sure there are consequences for their actions. Jaden nodded slowly, but didn't speak. His eyes remained on the ground, his fists clenched tightly by his sides. He didn't trust these words, not yet, not when the people who were supposed to protect him were the ones who had caused him harm. But even as his mind wrestled with this conflicting mix of emotions, he knew deep down that something was changing, something bigger than just this moment, something that could have long-lasting effects. He didn't know if it was going to be enough, but he had to hope it was. As Hall turned back to Miller and Davis, Jaden could hear Hall's voice grow firmer again. I expect both of you to cooperate fully with the investigation, he commanded, his eyes flashing with authority. And I'll be following up personally on this matter. Miller and Davis nodded silently, both of them looking like they wanted to disappear into the pavement beneath their feet. They couldn't hide from Hall's gaze or the reality of their own actions. Jaden could see their guilt on their faces, and it made him feel a little more justified in his own anger. But it didn't erase the trauma they had caused him. Nothing could undo that. The tension in the air lingered for a moment before Hall turned back to Jaden. I know it's not much, but I want to offer you a ride home, he said, his voice now calmer as he gestured toward the SUV parked nearby. You shouldn't have to walk after everything that's happened. Jaden hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure what to make of Hall's offer. It felt almost too much like a consolation prize, something to smooth over the mess that had just unfolded. But Jaden couldn't deny the exhaustion. He felt his body drained from the emotions of the encounter. I'm fine, Jaden said quietly, but Hall wasn't having it. I insist, he said firmly, his expression softening slightly. At least let me make sure you're safe. Jaden looked up at Hall's face, and for the first time since the whole incident started, he saw a sincerity there. He wasn't sure he trusted it, but he appreciated the gesture after everything that had happened. He wasn't sure he wanted to be alone anymore. Chief Hall seemed to understand, and without waiting for another reply, he stepped towards the SUV and opened the door for Jaden. Come on, he said. Let's get you home. Jaden walked towards the car slowly, still processing everything that had just unfolded, but there was a small part of him that felt a little bit of relief, even if it was fleeting. At least for now, this nightmare seemed to be over. And as he slid into the back seat of the SUV, he let out a long breath, not realizing until that moment how much he had been holding in. As Jaden settled into the back seat of the SUV, the door shut behind him with a soft click, and the engine roared to life. He looked out the window, watching the streets blur past. The city outside felt distant now, like a world he had been temporarily pulled from. The events of the past few minutes still hung in the air like smoke, and his mind raced trying to make sense of it all. Chief Hall sat in the front seat, silent for a moment. The sound of the car humming through the streets was the only noise breaking the quiet. The tension was palpable. But Hall broke the silence first. I'm sorry again for what happened, he said, his voice gentle, but his tone was heavy with the weight of the situation. You didn't deserve any of that. Jaden stared out the window, not meeting his gaze. He wasn't sure how to respond to that apology. He didn't know what words could make this right after everything that had just happened. The humiliation, the fear, the anger. The boy's entire day had been turned upside down, and it felt like it wasn't enough just to be told sorry. The memory of the officer's harsh words and their assumptions clung to him like a shadow. I just don't understand, Jaden finally said, his voice low, but it carried the weight of his frustration. Why'd they do that to me? What did I do wrong? Hall sighed softly and glanced at Jaden through the rearview mirror. You didn't do anything wrong, he said firmly. That's the problem. Hall's words were sharp and clear. He knew this wasn't just about Jaden. This was a much bigger issue. It was about systemic problems, about the way people like Jaden were often treated because of their skin, and because of preconceived biases that had no basis in reality. People like you shouldn't have to deal with this, Hall continued, his voice hardening slightly as he spoke. It's not right, and it's something we've been working to change for a long time, but change takes time. Jaden's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching Hall's gaze for a brief moment, and for the first time since the encounter, he saw a different side of the man. He didn't know if he could fully trust it yet, but he could see that Hall was sincere about wanting things to be different. Jaden wasn't sure he could let go of the anger that had built up inside him. It still burned deep within him like an unhealed wound. But something in Hall's words made him think maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for things to improve. It was a small glimmer of hope. But all the same, they drove in silence. For a while the streets outside seemed to reflect Jaden's internal conflict. Everything felt overwhelming, like he was trapped in a moment. He couldn't escape from the city that had always felt familiar to him, now seemed cold and indifferent. As he watched it pass by, Hall glanced at Jaden again after a few minutes, his expression softening as he spoke. "I want you to know that this situation isn't going to be swept under the rug," he said, his voice more personal now. "We're going to get to the bottom of it, and the officers involved will face the consequences of their actions." Jaden nodded, but it felt like a hollow promise to him. He had heard words like these before from different people in different situations, and they rarely led to real change. "I hope so," Jaden muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. Hall heard him though, and nodded in understanding. He didn't offer more empty words this time. Instead, he focused on driving the car through the city streets, the hum of the engine filling the silence between them as Jaden sat back in his seat, trying to find a way to let go of the weight that still clung to him like a heavy coat. He wanted to believe things would be different, but he knew better than to place his faith entirely in words alone. He had seen too much of the world to expect real change to come easily. The ride felt long, even though it was only a few miles back to Jaden's neighborhood. As the car hummed along the streets, Jaden's thoughts were a whirlwind. He couldn't shake the images of Miller and Davis standing over him, their harsh words, and the way they treated him, the humiliation of being singled out for no reason other than the color of his skin. It was all still so fresh in his mind. The feeling of being powerless in the face of authority haunted him. But there was also a small part of him that was grateful that someone had stepped in. Someone had finally recognized what was happening and taken action, even if it was his father's boss. Jaden wasn't sure how to process it. All his emotions felt like they were constantly shifting from anger to confusion to exhaustion and back again. The car slowed as they approached his neighborhood, and Jaden couldn't help but notice how different it felt now. The streets that had once seemed familiar now felt foreign, like he didn't fully belong here anymore, like the world had shifted beneath his feet. And he wasn't sure where he stood anymore. Chief Hall glanced at Jaden from the rearview mirror again, and his voice broke through the silence. "I know it's not much, but I want to make sure this situation doesn't follow you around," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "You're not going to be labeled as a troublemaker or some kind of threat because of what happened tonight." Jaden looked up at Hall for a moment, his eyes searching the older man's face. He didn't know if he could trust Hall's words fully, but part of him wanted to believe them. Part of him wanted to think that maybe things could be different, that maybe this wasn't just another empty promise like so many others had been before. But the weight of his past experiences made it hard to hope too much. Still, Jaden nodded slowly. "I appreciate that," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. As the car turned down his street, Jaden could see the familiar sights of his neighborhood appearing ahead of them, the rows of houses and the old streetlights flickering as they passed under them. It shouldn't have been comforting, but now it just felt like a reminder of everything he had to face every day, the expectations, the judgments, the assumptions. It all weighed on him, and it was hard to shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. When the car finally came to a stop outside his house, Jaden hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure if he was ready to leave the quiet of the car behind and step back into the world that had treated him so unjustly tonight. He sat there for a moment, looking out the window at his house, the lights on in the windows casting a soft glow on the front porch. His mother and father would be inside, unaware of everything that had happened to him tonight, unaware of the danger he had been in and the tension he had just barely escaped. Hall turned around in his seat, once more looking directly at Jaden. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't just blow over," he said, his voice filled with determination. "You deserve better than this, and I'll make sure the investigation is handled properly. You're not going to be forgotten in all of this." Jaden glanced at him for a moment before slowly opening the car door. He didn't have the strength to respond. His mind was too clouded with everything he had been through and the uncertainty of what would happen next, but there was a quiet gratitude that flickered in his chest as he stepped out of the car. "Thanks," he said softly, not sure if it was enough to express how he felt, but it was all he could manage. Hall nodded, and as Jaden walked up the driveway to his front door, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed in ways he wasn't ready to understand yet. As he stepped inside his house, the warmth and familiarity of home didn't feel as comforting as it once had. It felt like a place he had to protect from the world outside. and that thought alone weighed heavily on him. Jaden closed the door behind him and stood in the entryway. For a moment the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the TV from the living room. His mother and father were both home, but they hadn't yet realized what had happened. They were just living their lives unaware of the storm that had swirled around Jaden. Not an hour ago, he wanted to tell them everything, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't sure how to explain it, how to make them understand what he had been through, how to convey the rage and the confusion he felt inside. His mother's voice called out from the living room. "Jaden, is that you?" she asked sweetly, but there was a hint of concern in her tone. She must have heard the door shut and noticed his silence. Jaden forced a smile as he stepped into the living room. "Yeah, it's me," he said, trying to sound casual, but it came out strained. His mother looked up from her place on the couch, her eyes immediately noticing the change in his demeanor. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice warm, but she could tell something was off. The way he stood there like a storm was brewing inside of him. Jaden shrugged, not wanting to burden her with the details. He wasn't ready to talk about it. Not yet. He could see the concern in her eyes though, and it made him feel guilty, like he was hiding something from her. He couldn't do that. He knew his mother too well. She would see through him in a heartbeat. "It was fine," he said, his voice quieter than usual. His mother didn't believe him, but she didn't press. She just gave him a soft smile and nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice kind but cautious. "If you need anything or want to talk, you know where I am." Jaden nodded gratefully, but didn't say anything in response. Instead, he just sat down next to her on the couch, his mind still heavy with everything that had happened. The incident with Miller and Davis was still fresh in his mind. But now there was something else on his mind too, something that had come to him as soon as he stepped into the house, something he had been pushing aside since the moment he first saw Chief Hall. It was the look on Hall's face, the way the man had spoken to him with so much authority, yet with a hint of something else in his eyes. Jaden didn't fully understand it, but he knew it wasn't just about the apology. It was something deeper, something that made him question everything he thought he knew about the people in charge, the system that was supposed to protect him. Jaden had been taught all his life that there were good people out there, people who fought for justice and righted wrongs, but now he was starting to wonder if that was just a story they had told him to make him feel safe. Was it really that simple? Was Chief Hall really different? Or was he just another person playing a role in a system that didn't care about people like him? The thought gnawed at him, and it was hard to shake the feeling that maybe he wasn't as protected as he had always believed. He thought back to the way Miller and Davis had treated him, and how quickly they had assumed he was guilty. Just because of how he looked, it wasn't just one bad experience, it was the reality of living in a world that constantly saw him as a threat. And in that moment, Jaden realized something crucial, something he couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't just about one encounter or one apology. It was about a much bigger fight, a fight for justice, a fight for recognition, a fight to be seen for who he really was and not just what others assumed he was. He didn't know what the next step was or how to even begin taking action. But one thing was certain, he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. He couldn't stay silent anymore. Jaden had to figure out how to make his voice heard. He had to stand up for himself and for others like him, or nothing would ever change. The night dragged on as Jaden sat on the couch beside his mother, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts he couldn't quiet. No matter how hard he tried, his mind kept returning to that moment with Officer Miller and Officer Davis, the way they had treated him, how they had assumed he was guilty of something just because of the way he looked. The anger in his chest still burned, but now it was mingled with something else, something deeper, a sense of urgency, a need to understand how and why things had gone so wrong, and what he could do about it. His mother noticed the tension in his body, but didn't press. She had a way of sensing when he was troubled, but always gave him space to talk when he was ready. After a while she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "Jaden, you've been quiet all night. Is everything okay?" Her tone was laced with concern, but also with a quiet strength that made Jaden hesitate. He didn't want to worry her, didn't want to bring up the ordeal again. But something in him told him he couldn't keep it inside. "Not anymore, Mom," he said, his voice quiet and uncertain. She turned to him immediately, her eyes filled with love and patience. "What's wrong?" she asked, her hand gently resting on his. "It was the cops," Jaden said, his voice breaking slightly. "I got stopped by 2 officers today. They treated me like I was some kind of criminal." His words spilled out in a rush, his anger from earlier surfacing once again. His mother's face shifted, her expression turning serious and sad. As she listened, she already knew the kind of world her son lived in, knew the prejudice and bias that existed around them, but hearing it come from him like this was a reminder of how deeply entrenched those issues were, how real they were for him. "Tell me what happened," she said, her voice calm but firm. Jaden told her everything from the moment he was stopped on the street to the moment Chief Hall had shown up and intervened. His mother listened quietly, not interrupting, but her face grew darker as he spoke. She could feel the weight of what he was saying, the fear, the injustice, the frustration he had experienced. She knew what it was like to live in a world that didn't always see you as a person, but she had never had to experience it firsthand like he had. "I don't know what to do, Mom," Jaden said after he finished speaking, his voice barely of a whisper. "It feels like nothing will ever change no matter what I do." His mother squeezed his hand gently, her voice full of quiet strength as she spoke. "You're not alone, Jaden," she said. "There are people who are fighting for change, and you can be part of that fight. You don't have to fight it by yourself." Jaden looked at her, unsure how to respond. He wasn't sure he was ready to take on such a big fight, or he even had the strength to do so. But he knew his mother was right. There were people out there working to change the system. But he couldn't help but wonder if it would ever be enough, if his voice would ever truly matter in a world that seemed determined to silence people like him. The thought of fighting against such a deeply rooted system was overwhelming, but at the same time Jaden knew that staying silent wasn't an option anymore. He had already been pushed too far too many times for him to just ignore it anymore. "I don't know if I can do it," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm just one person." His mother met his gaze, her eyes steady and full of pride. "One person can make a difference," she said firmly. "You have a voice, Jaden, and it matters. Don't ever forget that." Her words hung in the air like a promise, and for the first time that night Jaden felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't sure how or when, but maybe this was the beginning of something bigger, a journey he wasn't meant to take alone, a fight that needed to be fought even if the road ahead was uncertain. The next few days passed in a blur for Jaden. He went to school as usual, but everything felt different, like he was walking through life in a fog. The incident with the cops still weighed heavily on him, and it seemed like every moment was filled with a kind of quiet tension. His classmates acted as if nothing had changed, but Jaden couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted inside of him. It wasn't just the unfair treatment, it was the realization that this kind of thing happened all the time, that people like him were often treated as less than human, judged based on assumptions that had no basis in reality. It made him angry, but it also made him feel small, like the world was too big and too complicated for him to ever truly understand or change. As the days went by, he began to think more about what his mother had said about using his voice to make a difference, but it wasn't that simple. He had no idea where to start or what his voice could even accomplish in the face of so much injustice and hate. One afternoon after school, as he walked home still lost in his thoughts, Jaden noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. Down the street from his house was a group of people gathered on the sidewalk holding signs that read phrases like "Black Lives Matter" and "Justice for All." They were peacefully protesting something. Jaden wasn't sure what, but as he approached them, his curiosity got the better of him. He walked closer and saw a few familiar faces from school, people he knew but had never really spoken to before. They stood together in a small group, talking passionately about what they believed in. Jaden felt a sudden rush of emotions as he watched them, the fire of their conviction, the strength in their voices. It reminded him of what his mother had said about standing up for what's right, about using his voice to fight for change. He stood there for a moment, unsure if he should join them, but something inside him urged him to step forward. He took a deep breath and walked toward the group, his heart pounding in his chest. One of the people in the group, a girl from his class named Maya, noticed him first. She gave him a warm smile and waved him over. "Hey, Jaden," she called out. "Glad you could join us." Jaden hesitated, but then smiled back and stepped into the circle of people. Maya introduced him to the rest of the group, and they all greeted him with friendly smiles. But there was a sense of urgency in their eyes that told Jaden they weren't just there to have a conversation. They were there to make a change. They were ready to fight for something bigger than themselves. They talked for hours about the issues facing their community, about police brutality and systemic racism, about the importance of standing together and using their voices to create change. Jaden listened intently as they spoke. Their words resonated deep within him like a call to action. He realized then that this was what he needed to do. This was where he could make a difference, not by staying silent, not by retreating into the background, but by standing up and joining the fight. He didn't know where it would lead or how it would change the world, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't keep living in fear and silence anymore. He had to speak out for himself and for others who were suffering just like he had been that day when he was stopped by the cops. "We need more voices," Maya said passionately as the group gathered around her. "We need people to speak out and show that we won't be silenced anymore." Jaden felt the weight of her words as they settled into his heart. He knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time in days, he felt a spark of something inside of him, something powerful, a sense of purpose that was bigger than the anger he'd been holding onto. It was the beginning of his own journey to stand up and be heard. The following weeks were filled with moments of uncertainty and hope as Jaden immersed himself in the growing movement around him. He started attending meetings with Maya and the others. Their group was small, but their passion was undeniable. They met after school in local community centers and even in each other's living rooms, planning their next steps and organizing peaceful protests. Jaden felt a sense of belonging in those spaces he had never experienced before. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was part of something bigger, a movement for change, something that made him feel like he could finally make a difference in the world. He had so often felt disconnected from. He still remembered that feeling of being targeted and humiliated by the cops. But now that memory was becoming fuel for his resolve. He knew he wasn't the only one who had been through it. There were countless others who had faced the same treatment and worse, and that was why he couldn't remain silent anymore. The more Jaden became involved in the movement, the more he realized how much work there was to do. It wasn't just about making noise or holding signs. It was about changing the hearts and minds of people who didn't understand the struggles that Black communities faced on a daily basis. It was about fighting for justice and equality on every level, from the police force to the school system to the workplace. It wasn't going to be easy, but Jaden was starting to understand that real change didn't happen overnight. It was a slow and difficult process, one that required patience, persistence, and unity. Jaden's father had heard about the protests and the meetings. He had seen the signs around town and the coverage on the news. One night after dinner, he sat down with Jaden in the living room, his face serious. "Son, I know what you're doing. I know you've been involved in these protests," he said, his voice calm but with a hint of concern. "I just want you to be careful. I don't want you to get caught up in something dangerous." Jaden looked at his father and saw the genuine worry in his eyes, but also something else, a sense of understanding that wasn't there before. His father wasn't just concerned about his safety. He was concerned because he understood what this fight was about. Jaden knew his father had grown up in a different time and had seen the world change in ways that he could never fully understand. But now he saw that his father's experiences had shaped the way he viewed the world, and his concern for Jaden's involvement was rooted in that. "I know what you're saying, Dad," Jaden replied, his voice steady. "But I can't just sit back and do nothing. I've seen what happens when we stay silent, and I don't want to keep living like that." His father nodded slowly and sighed. "I get it, son, I do," he said. "Just promise me you'll be careful and stay true to what you believe in." Jaden nodded without hesitation. "I will, I promise." And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed that he could make a difference. Jaden was no longer afraid to speak up or to stand out. He had found his voice, and he knew that no matter how hard the road ahead might be, he was ready to walk it with strength and conviction. And even though there would be obstacles and setbacks along the way, Jaden felt a renewed sense of hope and purpose. He was ready to be part of the change he had always dreamed of seeing in the world. And with that resolve burning in his heart, he knew he was no longer just a victim of the system. He was a fighter for justice. As the weeks passed, Jaden's involvement in the movement grew stronger. The group continued to organize protests and hold meetings, and Jaden found himself at the center of it all. His voice had become one that people listened to. He wasn't just another teenager speaking out. He was a young man who had lived through the injustice, who had been silenced for far too long, and now he was determined to make his voice heard. There were moments when Jaden felt exhausted, when the weight of everything seemed too much to bear. The protests were tiring, and the resistance from some people in the community was overwhelming, but there were also moments of triumph, small victories that made all the effort worth it. When a protest turned into a march down the streets with hundreds of people chanting for justice, when a local news station reached out to interview him about the work they were doing, Jaden felt a spark of hope. He realized that their message was starting to reach more people. Their voices were starting to be heard in a world that had long ignored them. But despite the victories, there were still the challenges, the obstacles that seemed to stand in the way of real change. Jaden knew that the fight for justice wouldn't be won overnight, and that it wouldn't be easy. The road ahead would be long and difficult. But he was no longer afraid of the struggle. He had seen what happened when people gave up, when they allowed themselves to be silenced, and he wasn't going to let that happen to him or anyone else who had been left behind in the shadows. One day after another successful march, Jaden found himself sitting alone in the park near his house watching the sunset. He was tired, but content. There was a sense of peace that came with knowing he was fighting for something real, something important. But as he sat there, he also felt a weight in his chest, a realization that had been creeping up on him for a while. It wasn't just about the movement or the protests, or even the fight for justice. It was about his own journey, his own growth. Jaden had changed over the past few months. He had become stronger, more confident, and more determined than ever before. He had found his purpose, and in doing so, he had discovered something deeper within himself. He had learned that the fight wasn't just about changing the world around him, it was also about changing himself. And it was that change that would ultimately lead to the bigger change he hoped to see in the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jaden stood up and took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air against his skin. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. There were others who were fighting alongside him, and together, they could make a difference. Jaden had learned that even in the face of injustice, the power of community and solidarity could overcome any obstacle. And as he walked back to his house with his head held high, he knew that his journey was just beginning. There would be more struggles and challenges along the way, but he was ready for them, ready to continue the fight for justice and equality, knowing that his voice mattered, knowing that he had the power to make a difference one step at a time.